Welcome again to session 3 of our conference, You and Your Neighborhood. Today we're going to look at the commons. The commons is both a cultural and natural resource, and most importantly, as a political question. Commons are resources that are accessible to all members of society. So, if we're going to look at the commons, we need to ask ourselves what aspects of the physical urban environment would we consider as the commons, and what is the relationship between citizens, the commons, and the city. This is clearly a political question. The commons also involve norms and values or social practice that governs a resource. So, not by state or market forces alone, but by societal norms. The way society self governs the resource through the tangible and the intangible institutions that it creates. What we define as the commons, how we ensure access to them, and for whom are critical questions for the future. The pandemic makes the need to broaden access to essential resources even clearer. Our speakers today will talk about their perspectives on the commons, each bringing to the table a different vantage point, but all really speaking of bottom up approaches, from policy to people centric to space itself being the focus. Our first speaker, Liane Lefaivre, wrote Ground Up City and will speak of her research on the identification and development of several hundred playgrounds in Amsterdam and how that process of developing the commons has become so much part of the identity of the city. Liane curated a historical exhibition on Aldo van Eijk's post-war Amsterdam playgrounds and has written widely on the playground since. Play as a design tool, published 3 years later, is based on research into playground planning and was funded by the Dutch Ministry of Education. And with her students in Vienna, she's also conducted playground design and planning studios as a means of enhancing integration in multicultural neighborhoods in the city. Liane was professor and chair of architectural history and theory at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. She has written and co-authored several other books, including with Alexander Zonas, the Times of Creative Destruction, Architecture and the City in the 20th Century, and most recently, an expanded edition of Regionalism in the Globalized World. Our next speaker is Sushma Iyengar, who is a social activist and an educator. And she has been working with women who are, as she puts it, coming to terms with masculine oriented urban spaces. Sushma has founded several cooperatives for women in Bhuj and has really led transformative action with marginalized communities on gender justice, indigenous cultures, traditional livelihoods, local governance, and post-disaster rehabilitation. Based in Kutch, she is an associate professor at the Center for Heritage Management at Ahmedabad University and has written and curated exhibitions on these issues. The third speaker is Aziza Chaouni, and she will talk about the Medina in Fez. In fact, she's going to talk to us from Fez. Aziza teaches at the University of Toronto, but a few days ago returned to Morocco, to her hometown, and so I think we're very lucky. She has a practice in Morocco and has won several top design awards and recognitions, including the Wholesome Gold Award for Sustainable Construction in 2009, and has been published and exhibited widely. And our discussant is Shivani Chaudhry, who is the Executive Director of Housing and Land Rights Network in Delhi. Prior to this, she worked at the Center for International Environmental Law in Washington, D.C. And Shivani has been working in the field of human rights for over 15 years with a specific focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, especially the human rights to adequate housing, land, livelihood, and the environment. She has been engaged actively with issues related to forced evictions, displacement, homelessness, land rights, disasters, climate justice, discrimination, women's rights, and human rights education. So I'm sure we'll lead a very interesting discussion. Let's begin. I now ask Liane to present her research. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Nandita Correa, for inviting me to this event to honor Charles Correa's monumental contribution, comprising buildings and urban plans, as well as his work as an activist and writer in post-independence in Canada, Latin America, Europe, and South Africa. He was one of those architects and planners of his generation for whom there was no inherent contradiction between a top-down approach built on public sector government planning policies with one that was ground up, that is based on participation in an effort to enhance community, a word that has vanished from architecture and vanished from architecture and planning towards the end of the early 1970s, but was just beginning to be practically ubiquitous from the early 1950s on, when Charles was a student in the US. Today, I'll be presenting what I think was the very first public space not only imagined, but actually carried out in this spirit. It began to take shape in 1947 as part of the post-World War II reconstruction of Amsterdam. Among its distinctive features are, first, that it was centered on the child, more precisely on the child at play. Second, this public space was huge. It was made up of not one, not two, not three, not 20, not 100 playgrounds, but over 800 of them. And they were spread throughout the city, regardless of social class. Third, it was laid out according to what I've called the PIP principle. P for participatory, I for interstitial, and P for polycentric. I'll come back to this point, of course. The enumeration goes on. The fourth feature of these playgrounds was, on one hand, that this public space was the result of a commons type activism in the strictest sense of the term. That is, as defined by the commons' main representative today, economics Nobel Prize winner Elinor Nordstrom. That is, it emerged from the ground up as a result of people power coming up from a group of citizen activists. However, it was also generated top down as a result of policy decisions on the part of a nascent post-war welfare state that responded responsively to the call of its citizens. And the fifth truly unique distinguishing feature of these playgrounds was that it formed an unmitigated, resoundingly successful public space. It transformed Amsterdam and still underlies an important part of the city's identity. Indeed, the Amsterdam playgrounds were the first example, not only of a new type of playground design, but also of a new approach to the design of public space and a new urban design that emerged in the post-war period. Generated, as I said, ground up and top down, it resulted in a new shape of community, to use a term that Serge Shemaev and Alexander Zonis coined in their book of 1972 by the same title, a book which was probably the last one to appear on the topic of community. This new public space grew out of the ground zero of inhumanity left by the trauma of the Second World War in Europe, and the deeply felt solidarity following its unprecedented savageness. There's no paradox here. As the late 18th century German anti-war, anti-absolutist writer Friedrich Schiller wrote, "Play is an important way to tame the savageness of life." In fact, he's famous for saying that human beings are never more human than when they're at play. In order to understand what made the post-war Amsterdam playgrounds such a success at the time and still today, as well as argue that this tool of urban planning or design is still useful in cities today, a look at the big picture is in order. This picture has two parts. One pertains to the cultural value of play in Western culture. The other explains how children's play came to galvanize the government of post-war Amsterdam. Because of the constraints of time today, I'll have to take the scissors to what I've already written on the topic in the number of books. Schiller wasn't the, now we come to the cultural value of play. Schiller wasn't the only writer to write about play. Rousseau did, Freud did, Johann Huizinga did. He devoted a whole book to it titled Homo Ludens. The list goes on and on. I'll not go into this literature at length, but I would like to single out the tradition that is deep-seated in the Netherlandish culture. There's a well-known topos of Netherlandish painting that depicts play in the city. It goes back to the 16th century. It appeared neither in Italian, nor French, nor Spanish painting of the time. These Netherlandish cities, exemplified here in a painting by Hendrik Overkamp in the 17th century, were unique in being part of a republic rather than a monarchy. And this depiction of play expresses the celebration of relative freedom and an egalitarian sense of community in a bourgeois city. It was, in a way, perceived as a luxury to be flaunted, the way portraits of monarchs flaunted their riches. As Simon Schama, the historian, points out in his Embarrassment of Riches, Kinderspelen, or children at play, that's the translation, formed a subtopos on the theme of adults at play. He remarks that the ubiquity of children in the Netherlandish paintings, not as allegorized angels, but as real, that is, as dirty and rambunctious, is another side of the same tradition. This is perhaps the most well-known example of this kind of painting, Peter Bruegel's Children's Games of 1560, now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. This tradition in painting, which placed playing children in identifiable urban settings, had a foundation in reality. Once a year, it was a tradition to have the children take over the professions of any given city. There was a child mayor, a child baker, a child candlestick maker, a child everything. It was not so much an expression of homo ludens for the sake of play alone. Nothing much in Dutch culture is ever far from some form of pragmatism. Role-playing in Netherlandish cities filled a practical purpose. It reflected the wish to instill Republican values, a Republican sense of community and responsibility to children from an early age, and bring them into the fold of the reality of civic life in a bourgeois society. The most efficient way to set this up as a learning process with young children was in a play setting. We can see that from this photograph that the impact of this kind of thinking had a lasting effect on Dutch urban life. But this tradition took a special twist in post-World War II Amsterdam. The Second World War was the harshest war in history, and in the Netherlands, no less than anywhere else. The entire city of Rotterdam was razed to the ground in 1940 by German bombers. Subsequently, Holland capitulated and was occupied. 200,000 people died, more than half of them Jews. The most difficult period of the occupation for the population as a whole was the so-called hunger winter of 1944, when the transport of food and fuel to the major cities was blocked. 20,000 people died of hunger and cold, among them many children. Spectacles such as these of the plight of children in the war left a deep mark on post-war culture, when a massive movement of child empowerment took shape in many forms, in the form of the UN Rights of the Child Declaration, in the many movies and novels about children, in the spread of interest in child psychology, and in the spread of the playgrounds movement, which was very strong until Jane Jacobs popped the bubble with her condemnation of the way they were carried out in her Death and Life of American Cities. But then she didn't know about the Amsterdam playgrounds. So eventually the war did end, of course. Life started to get back to normal. Planes flying overhead no longer meant danger. People went back to work. Children returned to school. After this savageness of war, people also sought relief in play. People wanted to celebrate, and they did, the way adults do. They also celebrated the way children do. But children also wanted to play. They wanted to celebrate the end of the war. But there were no provisions for them. Everything that was the public, they had to rely on ad hoc improvisations for their play. It was in 1947 that the fact that there were not enough playgrounds in the city dawned on Jacoba Mulder. Jacoba Mulder was the first woman to graduate from the field of urban planning at the Delft Institute of Technology. And when there was a job opening in the newly founded Department of Public Works in Amsterdam in 1930, she applied and got the job, eventually becoming the associate director and eventually the director herself in the 1960s. She was always an innovative figure. Before the war, she designed the first of all sand playgrounds in Amsterdam, and she was responsible for redesigning the prototype for social housing in Amsterdam. By 1947, Mulder was working in the Public Works Department directly under its director. On this particular day, as she set out on her way to work, she noticed children playing in the dirt and mud at the base of a tree outside her apartment house. When she arrived at the office, she told the director, And remarkably, in the midst of a gigantic, arduous reconstruction of a post-war city, he decided to act. The new director called on a newly hired young architect, fresh out of architecture school, to design a playground in front of Mrs. Mulder's door. His name was Aldo van Eijk, an architect who would incidentally come to work alongside Charles Correa, as well as with James Sterling, Candilis Josek and Woods, Christopher Alexander, Atelier 5, and others in an exemplary housing project in Lima, Peru, called Previ, commissioned by the democratically elected government of Fernando Belaúnde Terry with United Nations funding. Initiated in 1966, it never reached its full potential because of the military coup in that country of 1968. To get back to 1947, from then on, Aldo van Eijk spent 15 years designing 800 playgrounds of Amsterdam single-handedly. He devised around 20 pieces of elemental play furniture out of concrete or metal tubing, which he then combined and recombined in situ, always in relation to the unique configuration of each plot of land, like variations on a theme. His influences were ones that had influenced him during his studies in Zurich during the war. First and foremost, the rebelliously iconoclastic primitivist Dada artists who were refugees there, more or less at the same time. Tristan Tzara, Sophie Tauber-Arp, Arp himself, Kurt Schwitters, along with the work of Dutch de style figures like Piet Mondrian, who Van Eyck would call an angel, and Theo van Doesburg. For all his artistic borrowings from these artists, for Van Eyck, the importance of the Amsterdam playgrounds went beyond pure art or pure aesthetics. This is where a great deal of his originality lies. He used formal ideas inspired by the greatest artists of his time in the service of the public sector and for the public good, and he did so throughout his long career, designing not only for children, but children deprived of family life and in public care. This was something he was particularly devoted to. His Amsterdam orphanage was designed for abandoned children, and his Moederhuis of 1973 served as a halfway house in which children could be visited by their mostly single parents as a means of keeping a relationship alive. In any event, here are some of the very basic furniture, play furniture that he designed. And here is an example of here's proof of how interested he remained throughout his career in designing for children. This is a presentation of his that he gave in one of the CIAM meetings. And here is the first playground he designed at the door of the apartment of Jacoba Mulder. What happened next is surprising. The Bertelmann Plain playground set off an unstoppable wave of participatory democracy. The first step was taken by another woman who lived nearby, who passed the playground, and when she got back home, immediately addressed a letter to the director of public works for one in front of her own house. And here is the envelope that I found in the archive, and here is her letter. This is just, and here is another letter from a group of, from a whole neighborhood These two are just a couple of the hundreds of letters that followed. This brings us to the one missing protagonist so far in this story, and that is the director of public works, under whom Jacobe Mulder and Aldo van Eijk worked. This was Cornelis van Esteren, a towering figure in 20th century architecture and planning. He had been one of the co-founders both of De Stijl with Theo van Doesburg and Mondrian. He had worked on a design with Theo van Doesburg. And he'd been a co-founder of Siam with Le Corbusier, Mies, Gropius, Sert, and everyone else. In 1927, he had won the competition for a major avenue in Berlin called Unter der Linden. And this is his competition entry. Like his friends Le Corbusier, Hilbersheimers, and before him, Tony Garnier, Van Esteren thought big. He thought regimentation. He thought order. He thought top-down, without much immediately apparent concern for life on the ground. But as opposed to these friends of his, he accepted a job as a civil servant in Amsterdam in 1929, working in a hands-on way instead of a bookish, theoretical, and often self-servingly sales pitch-based one. Van Esteren remained in the job until he retired and created after the war some of the best, most exceptional urban planning schemes of the whole post-war period, in particular the new towns to the west of Amsterdam. In 1947, there were only 29 playgrounds in the whole Amsterdam. This is the same number as there were in 1929 when Van Esteren commissioned a series of city maps. One map marked the location of the city's toilets, another the open-air markets, another its garages, etc., etc. Finally, one indicated the locations of the playgrounds in the city. In order to reach the number of 800, which happened in the early 60s, this means that no fewer than 50 playgrounds were designed and produced a year from 1947 on, a gigantic number. Now this brings us to the interstitial aspect of the we've seen the participatory aspect. Now we come to the interstitial aspect of the Amsterdam playgrounds. After the war, Van Esteren underwent a kind of metamorphosis. Here is his plan for the extension for the west of Amsterdam before the war in 1931. And here are some of his plans for Amsterdam after the war. As we can see, he is now interested in what is ground up. We see him starting to think of the interstices the leftover spaces of post-war Amsterdam, the lots which had been razed during the war. Amsterdam hadn't been bombed, but had become vacated. But ones that became vacated were used for firewood during the hunger winter. After the initial Bertelmann project, Van Esteren began to use these in-between spaces to ask Aldo van Eijk to design playgrounds on them. Moreover, because he was the public works department, he could also use public land, and there are many of such maps in the archive. Here are some of the interstitial spaces that Aldo van Eijk, on the other hand, designed for, tucked into wherever there was a space, a leftover space. Soon, under Van Estern's direction, what started off as a spontaneous response to citizen activism became official planning policy. From the first letter he received from a citizen of Amsterdam, for every request sent, a new playground was considered, submitted to his staff, and, if possible, built. He mobilized the whole department of civil servants to manage the playgrounds. An example of the painstaking care the department was involved in, here's a letter from Aldo van Eijk with the marks of at least 10 civil servants who had reviewed it. There are hundreds and hundreds of such memos. And right here we have the comment and the signature of Van Estern. And somewhere are the comments of Jacoba Mulder as well. Maybe this is them. Here are some of the images I found in the archive of the municipality of Amsterdam, which depict the transformative effect of these small, interstitial, participatory, bottom-up, top-down interventions that we'll review right now. They began in the center of, the first ones were in the center of Amsterdam in the 17th and 18th century fabric of the city. This is an instance of a lot that had been dismantled for firewood, and the effect of the playground next to it, following the intervention of the city. Here's another example of the effect of the playgrounds on these sites that had become derelict. And here's yet another in the same central area of Amsterdam. And as we see, the playgrounds formed a public space not only for children, but for adults. And adults sitting in the park, but also overlooking the park from their apartments. Their children were always within, always visible from the apartment and audible. And so that's what made them very safe. Here's another example of the same area. This happened 800 times, just to remind you. And here's another one. They gradually spread to the 19th century fabric of the town. And very interestingly, what was possible, because they were undertaken by the Public Works Department, they could intervene in on publicly owned land, such as this desert-like traffic intersection, which was turned into a really marvelous public space that brought a whole surrounding community together. That's another case. And then there were spaces that were just leftover spaces, and spaces on the fringes of the city that were transformed. Eventually, Van Estern, eventually this movement, the citizen movement, spread to the new towns that were being built by Van Estern in the west of the city. And they too started to ask for playgrounds. They weren't automatically built in these neighborhoods. They had to be requested by the citizens. And the number of them is just legion, naturally, because they really transformed what could have been a very anonymous housing project. Finally, we come to the P for polycentric. The best illustration for this is an animation built by the student assistants at the Technical University of Delft, where I carried out the first study of these, for an exhibition we did at the Stedelijk Museum. I think it speaks for itself. Where there had been empty, derelict lots, traffic intersections, and urban moonscapes, the playgrounds formed a separate city on top of the first, which reinforced ties of community, created through a process of participatory democracy, which arose from spontaneous citizen activism in a city recovering from the ravages of a war. And a caring urban planner, a devoted and talented architect, and a great urban planner. Now, I began to wonder if this precedent could be of any use as an urban design tool developed that had been developed for a monocultural, upwardly mobile post-war Dutch society. In particular, I wondered if it could be of any use in the new kind of neighborhood that was appearing all over European cities, and that is the new multicultural neighborhoods. I carried out a research project in the Oude West of Rotterdam with the office of Henk Deul in 2006. And we went into the neighborhoods, interviewed people, grown-ups and children, about where they thought playgrounds could be usefully located, and the result remained on paper. It was a very good idea. And there was an obvious desire to multiply interstitial playgrounds. When I started teaching in Vienna, along with my students there at the University of Applied Arts, I and my assistant at the time, the architect and now Professor Isben Onen, went into the multicultural 15th district and worked with children, social workers, to plot and make proposals for new playgrounds. We went in, 150 languages are spoken in this neighborhood, and we went and interviewed them. We really exhaustively went through the neighborhood for a period of 3 months, and tried out all kinds of different ideas, again, interviewing parents and children. The result was some design projects for individual playgrounds designed by the students. These are just 2 of them. And in addition, we brought some of the children to the university to get them interested themselves in design. And here we have a couple of these children from the neighborhood looking with awe at the kind of design that was being produced at the school. And this is the result. At the end of the day, the students, the children, I think, got a very good experience from the playgrounds. Of course, they haven't been built because we didn't have a Van Estern. Thank you.
Thank you, Liane. That was a fascinating journey you took us through. Thank you, ZX and Nandita, for bringing so many women together onto one platform. Well, Liane took us on a very fairly joyful journey with children. And in the same spirit, I would like to begin with a little bit of play for all of us. I'd like all of us to listen to a song put together by a group of women, intrepid women who have set up a cooperative in Delhi and run a cab service called the Sakha Cabs. Let's listen to their song, demanding for.
Darling, you're a young girl, hot girl, walking in the streets, gonna take on the world someday, gonna ruin the place, a big disgrace, can't pull butter all over the place. We need washrooms, toilets for women. We need washrooms, raise your voices, women. We need washrooms, urinals for women. Passionately, we need better facilities. You got period some taste, finding hygienic place. Don't know how to manage in a public space. Sing it. We need washrooms, which are safe for women. We need washrooms, no shame for women. We need washrooms.
Well, so that is contemporary Delhi, the capital of India. Women come together, empower themselves. A lot of them are victims of violence, single women. Well, they overcame huge challenges, came out to the streets and found that they don't have washrooms. I'll take you back now, more than 100 years ago, to a city called Bhopal, which is right at the center of India. Interestingly, the city was led by 7 generations of women through the 19th century. 1907 was when this city, which I call a feminine city, set up its first municipality by the Begum. And this city, those who have been to the city will be familiar with its features, with its lakes, with the green belt, which even today keeps the temperature almost 5 degrees less. Well, we go back 100 years and find a feminine city, and then come back to contemporary times to the masculine cities and towns that we live in. Let me just kind of unfold this term masculine city as I understand it, and for all of us. What is the masculine city? It really lies, I think, in the way cities transact, in the relationship with land, in the way it governs. At the core lies an impulse to really expand. This is not new. Through centuries, we have seen this across territories, we have brought it into our cities, which are very confined, finite spaces with the impulse to expand. Expansion, in any form of expansion, invariably entails, as you expand, it entails centralized governance, which means that the more you have, the more you spread, the more you need to start wanting to control. And which means that the state then becomes more central to the day-to-day experiences of living of its citizens. So slowly, the relationship then grows between the individual and the state, and the citizen vis-a-vis the state. So our security, services, safety entirely dependent on the state, the authoritarian state, rather than on each other. And slowly, the urban citizen becomes more and more an individual in order to safeguard one's entitlements in the urban space. And over time, as we all experience today, the two most dominant institutions in our lives, the state and the markets, both function precisely this way. And real estate, especially how land has been transacted, has really ensured that we have created individual class-based citizens and broken down the entire concept of the communities or an understanding of the commune. What are feminine spaces? And today I will take you through a little town, a town where I reside and live in, with a population of less than 200,000. Which overlaps 25 grown into a small urban town with its own municipality. And after we had a very major earthquake 19 years ago, this town suddenly expanded. Today, it has almost 30% of the population live in slums, in informal settlements, and more than 30% of the population. And it has almost 77 informal settlements across the city, which reside all on almost 6% of the land. Now, who resides here? Who are the communities who are residing on the margins in these informal settlements? These are largely communities who came into the city looking for work. And these are communities who have lived in very traditional villages, rural systems, rural forms of traditional governance, and then they slowly started flowing into the towns and into the cities. And this is the story of little towns across India, where it is really the rural and the urban coexisting with each other, an aspirational urban growing in the center space, and the rural which has come in, living in the margins, trying to breathe and trying to get this mainstream to acknowledge their presence, while actually they are living and making the city stick. If you can, Tahir, just for a moment, take me to the next. Yes, thank you. So these are the women who really are on the margins, but who create what we in contemporary life call the urban commons, which is the urban space is in fact a commons where we consume and produce together collectively. But who is making the city stick? And it's a range of the sanitation workers, the vendors, the migrants, the sex workers, the construction labor, the artisans. It is the range of women is precisely the ones who live on that 6% of land and who are 30% of the population. Tahir, if you can go back to the previous slide. Yeah, thank you. So today I will just take you through the contradictions of women on the margins, and as they confront, interface, and resist the aggression and the oppression of living in a space which is alien to them. When they come in, communities, the traditional communities, they, especially the first generation, they have come looking for work. So they have come, in a sense, to liberate themselves from the economics of the rural areas. But they do not necessarily come or want to abandon the cultural mores or the social norms which gives them identity. So they don't lose their identity of what they were, but they come in and neither do they completely integrate or adapt to the identity of an urban citizen. Tahir, can I put the next slide? Yes. And so today I will take you through two generations of women. One is the women who come in from the rural areas, who typically not retain their traditional identity, their dress codes, but more important, they bring with them the feminized culture of the commons, which they live with in the rural areas. The way they live and engage with their own communities. Their homes are shared spaces. Every home, in fact, is a creche for the others. The old are collectively cared for. Festivals are shared experiences. The way animals live and are interacted and interfaced and owned and cared for, and the plants and the trees, not only those which are aesthetic, but which have high utility value. It's the combination of the aesthetic and the use value of everything that constitutes the neighborhoods. And it's interesting that this is what what we call informal settlements or slums, just to borrow a term from larger cities, are really women and men communities who have brought back or brought in the rural into the urban and created the culture of the commons. But this culture is not integrated, not accepted, not acknowledged, not adopted by the governance of the city, as we all know. And so they continue to live on the margins within their class with a shared memory of the rural commons, in the nostalgia of the rural commons, and recreating, constantly reproducing bits and bits of it in their everyday life, and servicing what we call the urban commons. So it's interesting that while this generation of women, while they bring in a feminized culture of the commons, their own culture and society and houses also reproduce a lot of the patriarchy and the traditional patriarchy which was there in the rural areas. So while their homes are sites of deep patriarchy, their habitats are far more feminized and caring. And they continue to live, and this next generation that gets born, Tahir, if you can go to the slide. Can you go to the next slide, Tahir? Yes, I can see it. Yes. Yes, so the next generation of the young girls of Bhuj, who are the daughters of this first generation of women who continue with their traditional identities and yet pretty much stay in on the social and economic margins. Their daughters are very different. What about them? They want to step out of the strictures and suffocation of the community. They have not come. They have not come here to bring a bit of their own traditional past. They are aspirational. They want to liberate themselves from the sexual and social mores and norms. So they step out, aspiring actually to be individuals, while their own mothers continue to aspire to live within the community and the commons. And as they move about and move around, these young girls are suddenly faced with the violence of the city, with the masculinity of the city. And they, as they encounter these spaces, they suddenly realize the complete vulnerability of their own class. So while they have actually stepped out and feel liberated from their own mothers and grandmothers, they do not want to go back into the rural spaces. They want to enjoy the liberation of being an individual in an urban space, but they cannot integrate because they are those on the margins economically and politically. It's dealing with the completely different challenges of the first generation women and the second generation women, both of whom confront the non-acceptance of their class, of the culture of the commons in the cities, that led to a women's organization here, which I've been associated since its founding, called the Kashmahila Vikas Sangathan, which is a large collective of rural women in rural areas across the district, and decided to start forming a collective in the urban regions, precisely to enable women to overcome, resist, challenge, and reclaim their spaces in this urban town. And the story that unfolded was how these women and girls, in collaboration with a range of partners, started developing strategies to assert their presence in a city which does not accept them. So it went through a range of strategies. Tahir, I'm sorry, I'm not unable to see the screen. Yeah. Can we move to the strategies? Yes. The next one. The next slide, please. Yeah. So there were a range of strategic interventions which were brought in a sense, from the learning and experiences of organizing women and empowering them in rural areas across this region, across India. But the urban space is a far more political space, as we know. And one of the first things that the women confronted with is, of course, is the informal settlements, and the fact that they really had to confront and legitimize their own identities as citizens by legitimizing the land that they sat upon. And while the process of accessing land on which they could make their seemingly permanent settlements and housing, that entire process, which was a pilot initiative in the city to demonstrate how women could express how they lived, their own feminized experiences, when they start reimagining their own settlements with a new land. So this settlement, called the Ramdev Nagar, which came into being, it was very interesting that the process of developing these 300 homes with as many households began a whole dialogue with the women as to how they prioritize and how they wanted to go about it. The very first thing, with the very first negotiation that happened was whose houses would be built first. And there was really, because the largest group of the community led by the women were very clear that it was the 40 most vulnerable families who would get their first houses. And this process of caring, of collaborating, of reaching out to the most unreached, which I really call a process of feminization, which the city resists, is what these women were demonstrating. And so once the 40 households got their houses, and as the other houses started coming into being, the second was, how do they look at land? And there were families which were differently sized. But there again, there was a unanimous decision taken that all of them would get the same amount of land, which was 65 square meters of land on which their houses would be made. Once they all agreed that it would really equalize their own housing experience, then the process of how they actually reorganized their settlement, and they got into what is traditionally known as faryas, which are really, which is a concept come from the rural areas. And so they created 13 little spaces and faryas or commons from amongst the larger group. Within the faryas, their own houses, the image that you see is another little bit of commons where families share housing space, called the jodas, where you have two twin houses attached to each other with the ability to grow vertically over time. And then you create common spaces across the 13 little small communities of the 200 houses. So the process of a layered commons, right, beginning from your family to your sub-neighborhoods to a larger neighborhood, was what constituted the entire designing and planning process, which was undertaken with another organization called Hunarshala Foundation in the city. So this was the first demonstration, and the process of looking at land and. Let's move to the second strategy. Tahir, the next one. The second process really was, as I said, the young girls and adolescents were the first who started really articulating the lack of safety in a citizen, in them. And as they stepped out of their homes and were stepping out into completely unequal spaces because they were marginalized by class and by caste. Most of these women, as many of us in India know, are from the religious minorities. They are from the most vulnerable caste and from tribal communities. And so the second key strategic process was really to start advocating for organizing, enabling self-organizing of the girls and women and their mothers and their aunts over creating what they call the safe city. And it meant organizing them into girls' clubs, adolescent women demanding things from the municipality, but primarily organizing themselves and stepping out and expressing themselves on the incidents of violence that they were facing every day in their lives in the city. And it's an interesting process where actually these girls who are on the margins were taking the lead in enabling girls from the more privileged communities to come and speak out on the demand for a safe city. Next slide, Tahir. The third strategy was to enable a lot of these girls to, of course, they needed their source of income, but to organize these girls to enter, to penetrate, and in a sense to infiltrate the gender segregated spaces and occupations. And so that, for instance, I'm just giving you two incidents here. One image. Finding the little tuk-tuks or the and therefore organization started training in a sense like the first song that you heard where women were trained as cab drivers. Here young girls from these informal settlements have started getting trained as drivers of these auto rickshaws. And one of the first issues that they came up with is that where do we park? Where do we stand? Do we, as complete, as young girls, very few of us, do we go and park ourselves in the middle of other men and boys and make ourselves vulnerable? And so the process of identifying a space where they park themselves, where they also have spaces where they can interact with people with whom they are comfortable with, became a space for demand and entitlements. Similarly, getting them into different forms of communication and making them express themselves in the city again became very important. And so young girls getting trained in the electronic media was so different livelihood interventions, skilling to overcome their own fear, and the process of training itself became a space for them to come together and express their fears and overcome them. The next slide, please, Tahir. A fourth very important strategy was very important to visibilize the most invisible, the completely omniscient but invisible women, and that's the sex workers of the city, who are not only on the margins, but are constantly interfacing with the mainstream of the city, with the most powerful men of the city, and are pushed into deep vulnerabilities of shelter, of their economy, and of reproductive health. And so it was these women who really needed to come and organize themselves to be able to start being heard to begin with. And so the bunch of women that you see there are just a small group of the first section of women who are the sex workers who have formed a collective now, and that has been a very key strategy to start organizing other such omniscient invisible women, like the transgender, for instance. Next. The real key to this process of feminizing, which is a huge challenge, and it is not as if it has been undertaken, but it's a critical strategy, is to start feminizing the local governance and the citizenship, which meant that one really started engaging and empowering the women the women elected representatives in the municipality and in the municipal town, in their own identifying their own areas and their own wards, getting women to start asserting their citizenship, which, as I said earlier, in masculine cities, in our imagination of cities, we have individualized the whole concepts of citizenship across the country, across the global world. In our understanding of a democracy which is deeply integrated with global markets, everybody is an individual, and so to assert their identity as individual women, they have come together as collectives and organized themselves under the legal provisions of forming women's collectives in their own wards and engaging, therefore, with the women elected representatives and their own councillors who also have been getting trained because they themselves are deeply disempowered in the larger political space of the city and of their political parties. Next. This is just a small photograph of one of the wards, which is the city itself has been divided into 14 wards, and enabling the communities, the women in the communities, and the councillors of these wards to start engaging with each other, to start sensitizing each other and responding has become a key area. And finally, as I said, all the communities in the informal settlements on the margins continue to engage first with their own traditional systems of governance, with their traditional leaders, with their own community spaces. And as I mentioned earlier, that while they live in the culture of the commons in the rural areas, they continue to go back into their own home spaces, which have very high degrees of also domestic oppression and violence. And so it was not only looking at the safe city, which includes houses and homes and the lack of safety there. And this is not something where you only sensitize the police and the judiciary and the municipality and the mechanisms of governance, but sensitizing the traditional communities, the men who govern these communities, the uncles and the fathers and the sons, and so the organization took up each of these cities looking at own norms to start looking at child marriages in the communities, the laws that they pass, the way they regulate the movement of women and girls in their and so you have still rural space in the urban where you're almost absent from the mind and imagination of the urbanites. There are little huddles and little pockets where you engage and talk to the traditional leaders who sometimes resist norms which they have brought also from the rural areas. And so these are the contradictions that keep getting thrown up in the challenges of trying to organize women, getting them to assert their identity, getting them to assert their own imagination of what a city should be, and to stand up and be counted. I should stop there. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aziza Chaouni. I'm an architect and civil engineer, and I'm extremely excited to be part of this lecture series organized by the Charles Correa Foundation. I'm an immense fan of the work of Charles Correa, so this is really a great honor. And I'm extremely happy to be part of this session called Commons and the City. And I'll be talking to you today from my hometown of Fez, Morocco, about the mutation of the public realm in the Medina of Fez, which is the old city of Fez, Morocco. Before starting my lecture, I just wanted to say a few words about myself and about the connection that I have to the city of Fez. So I'm currently an associate professor at the John H. Daniel Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. And I'm also the principal of Aziza Chaouni project that has a small office in Toronto and one in Fez. And my connection to Fez actually dates from several generations. It goes back to my great-grandfather, Mohammed Chaouni, who came from a small village nestled in the mountains of the Rif in the north of Morocco. And he wanted to go to Fez to seek an education, and the Qarawiyyin Library, which at the time was the center of knowledge, not only for Morocco, but for most of North Africa. And it took him actually several months to reach Fez on a donkey's back, and he encountered thieves and so forth, but he finally made it. At the time, that was the effort that one had to do to have an education. He later became a lawyer and married my great-grandmother, that I'm named after, called Aziza, who was from Fez. So that's my own personal story. And this is the old city of Fez that my grandfather at the time reached to seek an education. You can see that it's nestled in a valley surrounded by olive groves. And when he arrived, he was housed in this building called the Madrasa Bornania, which is technically a dorm where students that did not live in Fez would live on the upper level, and on the ground floor that you can see here, there were rooms where they could study. And this is the Qarawiyyin Mosque, which was the largest mosque, is still the largest mosque in the Medina of Fez, and that acted at the same time as a religious institution, but also as an educational institution. So during the call for prayer and the prayer times was used for religious purposes. And when it was not the time for prayer, students gathered around different professors to learn about medicine, law, philosophy, and so forth. So as you can see, the central courtyard of the mosque was multi-purpose, as a multitude of programs, but it was considered as a main space for education, but also a main meeting space and public space in the Medina of Fez. And I just wanted to say a brief note is that this Qarawiyyin mosque that also acted as a center of knowledge and as a university was created by a woman, Fatima Fufiria, in the 9th century, and she dedicated her entire inheritance that she received from her father, who was a wealthy trader originally from Tunisia, to the construction of this mosque, but most specifically to the development of an educational center within the mosque. And I think for me, she really acts as a role model, as a very strong female role model, which in a way negates the image that one might have of females in a Muslim society being all repressed and not being agent in the construction of the city and the construction of the commons in the city. And in this case, the Qarawiyyin Library with University and mosque, with its very large courtyard that served a lot of public functions, was actually the result of the support and the thinking of this lady, Fatima Fufiria. So I would like to dedicate this lecture to her. And let's get back now to the Medina of Fez, which for many visitors today, when they actually go to it and visit it, they all share the same thought with me. Usually they said, it's as if time has stopped. And the Medina of Fez has actually proven to be extremely resilient to changes. Its urban fabric, even if it does change throughout the years, have retained a certain homogeneity as a whole. So its DNA has proven to be very resilient. As you can see here, its din is composed of a series of courtyard typologies that could actually house a diversity of programs, including public programs and the commons realm within the Medina of Fez. Those are usually the larger courtyards that you can see here in this aerial view. As you can see, there is an amazing homogeneity of the urban fabric. So let's now go over a little bit over the urban evolution of the Medina of Fez. So the Medina of Fez was the first capital city of the Kingdom of Morocco. It was created in 789 on the left bank of the Fez River. And as you can see, it was really organized around the Qarawiyyin Mosque and University, which was the beating heart of the city. Then over time, another new city was created on the right bank, which was called the Andalusian core of the city. So there were two towns that were next to each other. And this Andalusian core city was organized around the Andalus Mosque, was created in 809. Then in 1986, fortification walls were built around each one of these two city cores. In 1090, there is the emergence of a city wall that encompassed the two city cores on the two banks. Then as the two city cores grew, as the population grew, the two city cores formed only one urban fabric that was interconnected, and small bridges actually connected the two river banks. And obviously the reasons of the fortification was for the town to resist invaders. But what's very interesting is that because it was in a very fertile valley and it had access to water, even if all of the fortifications were closed, and this liminal space that you can see here between the city walls and the urban fabric actually used to house orchards and gardens. So the city, in a sense, even if it was entirely enclosed, could be self-sustaining. And later on in 1276, a new town emerged. It was called Fez Jadid. And that was organized around the palace of the new king. And you can see here in the north was the new Garrix, and also it had a Jewish quarter called the Melech that was actually placed right next to the royal palace for protection. And then this is the Medina of Fez today. And as you can notice, the urban fabric has grown all the way to the limit of the fortification walls. And actually there are new developments all around it. But within the city wall, you can see that the green spaces that were used to be productive, but also were used as major leisure spaces, almost all disappeared. And my own grandmother does remember that every weekend they would go to this garden spaces that were all productive for leisure and to picnic, which is not possible anymore today, since very, very few of these gardens remain. I wanted to share this with you to show you how the urban structure of the Medina, even if it transformed, has kept its main components, and that also what's actually explained its resilience and the consistency of its fabric despite so many changes that we're going to see. And so this is a plan of the Medina with its main components in 1200, and this is a plan of the Medina drawn by me in 2016. And as you can see, the main structuring elements are these commercial streets called the souks, which are technically markets, and the two mosques, the Qarawiyyin Mosque and the Andalus Mosque, if you recall, that formed the cores of these two proto-cities that then joined and then formed the Fez of today. Then, as you see in dark gray, are the industrial quarters and the craft production quarters, and obviously the river that crosses the city. And finally, in this gray color here are the residential fabric. As you can see in 2016, one can still perceive the same shape of the commercial streets that obviously have extended and have new branches. The industrial, let's say not industrial, but the craft production core have actually diminished because a lot of the craft production has moved away from the center of the Medina, since it does require more space. But the spaces of production still remain inside the Medina, and that really makes it a living city. So it's not a city only with residences, but it's a city where people work and people live and people produce. The major change here, as you can see, is with the residential fabric, which actually has grown a lot. And finally, what I forgot to mention are the cemeteries that were located also in this in-between space between the city fabric and the city walls, that also acted as leisure spaces. So both the orchards that are here shown in white and the cemeteries were major commons in the city. And one amazing aspect about the Medina of Fez is its incredible pedestrian network. It is the city in the world that has the largest pedestrian network. The streets vary in size. The pedestrian street between 1 point, sometimes 1 meter, all the way to 3 meters. Some of the streets that you can see here have been made a little bit larger to accommodate for cars that are starting to penetrate inside the city fabric. But truly what makes the Medina of Fez unique is its extensive public pedestrian network. And you can see that within this pedestrian network, I've marked here where the commercial street and the souks are today, and how they all connect still to the two Qarawiyyin Mosque and the Andalusian Mosque. Some photos of the pedestrian streets. Sorry, I'm hiding the cute cat here. So you can see they're extremely narrow, and you can see some of the souks here, and this is more of an residential street. And the souk, when it gets very busy, can get very dense, but it also, it's very lively as well. Now, I wanted to get a bit deeper before speaking about the commons and the typologies of public spaces in the Medina of Fez, about its urban structure, because it's actually quite special. So if one look really at the cell that constitute the Medina, it's what we call the Huma, which is the neighborhood, and different neighborhoods constitute a quarter, and then several quarters then constitute the Medina, that then is surrounded by city walls and cemeteries that can exist outside or inside, and also this white space here are for vegetable production. And what you can see within the neighborhood unit is that it's extremely introverted, that there is a dead end that leads to all of the different houses, so a first major dead end and then a secondary one. So there is really, and then, and the neighborhood usually lines a more public street that has all of the different public facilities. So as you can see, there is a very clear delineation between the public realm and the private realm. And it's really thanks to this dead end system. And when different quarters come together, then the entrance of the different quarters are marked by entry gates and very often a fountain. And we're going to see why fountains are very important parts of the commons in the Medina of Fez. This is simply an example, a case study within the Medina of Fez of this structure with the neighborhood, how there is, a secondary street network that's going to go off the main commercial street network. Within green public facilities, usually you have stores, bath, etc. To it comes a set of different residential units. Connected then, one can find a tertiary system of street network that's constituted of dead end alleys, to which are connected residential units. And if we zoom in one more level to study this this constitutive cell of the urban fabric of the Medina, we find, again, what I had mentioned before, the courtyard building typology that repeats in different formats. So those are three of the typical courtyard organizations. They can be also, in a way, categorized as small, medium, and large. If we look again at the three prevalent types within the Medina of Fez, based on my research, they share really common typology, which is one that the separation between public and private goes even further within the organization of the access to the courtyard. So you would never enter straight inside the courtyard, but you would always take an entrance that would actually wrap around, so that when you open the door, you're never facing the interior of the courtyard, even if the courtyard building is a public building. So how can we define the notion of the commons in the Medina of Fez? Well, I wanted to share with you first the traditional public spaces that one would have found only, I would say, about like a century ago, and they still exist and persist today, although with some transformation that we're going to be talking about. So obviously there is the mosque that also can act as a university, like the Qarawiyyin University, that my great-grandfather attended. The Madrasa, which is a Quranic school, where it's a Quranic school dorm as well on the upper levels, like my great-grandfather stayed at. You have the Funduk, which I can best describe as a mini mall that would have stores on the ground level, and on the higher level you would have a small hotel where traders from outside of town would come and stay. Then you have a Zawiya, which is a spiritual community center. Again, in all of these, the courtyard acts as a main meeting ground and is easily accessible by anyone from the street. Is a sanctuary, usually with the saintly figure is buried. The city gate, which is also a main point of gathering, where a lot of farmers would bring goods and sell them. The gardens and the orchards that exist between the city walls and the urban fabric, and the stores within the souk. When we look at the new type of public space in the Medina, one would find hotel lounges, since a lot of courtyard homes were transformed into hotels. This is a phenomenon of gentrification. You have new cafes, restaurants, museums, movie theaters, and few centers. The majority of these programs are housed within the courtyard typology, and when one gets to the outskirts of the Medina, there are new buildings that house these programs. And what I want to focus this lecture on is on a specificity of let's say, the commons in the Medina of Fez, and an element that really characterizes it is the element of water. Indeed, within most of these courtyards, as well as in the gardens and the orchards, water is extremely present, and it's really a defining character of these public spaces in the Medina of Fez. So if we look at the map of the Medina today, and we look more closely at the water network, we can see that it actually weaves itself in a very intimate manner. With the urban fabric of the city. And so what you see in dotted lines are streams that run beneath the urban fabric, and in solid streams that actually do appear. And this very extensive water network feeds and obviously irrigates the public open spaces that are mainly gardens that you can see, the only few ones that remain in green. But it also feeds a quantity of programs that rely on water or that have fountains. The majority of courtyard spaces that are public would have water features. And as you know, water is extremely important in Islam because of ablutions. But it also part of a lot of leisure gardens as well. And so, as you can see here, all of the public programs that I've mapped that relate to the water network in Fez. So you have the hammams, the mosques, which are, and masjid, which are small neighborhood mosques as well, where you always have a fountain that's typically used for ablutions, the zawiyas as well. And one thing actually to note is that Fez is very, very often called the city of 1,000 fountains. And I did found a mention in the book, you know, like about Africa by Leo Africanus from the 16th century that visited Fez and mentioned that it counted then 600 fountains, which is quite like an incredible number. And so some of the manifestation of this water network, so that you can see it, this is a very typical public water fountain for houses that did not have access to water within their own grounds. Some of them are still in use today. Fountains in the middle of the mosque, like here in the Karawin Mosque. A lot of them were very well crafted, mainly with marble and mosaics. This is, you know, like a set of fountains in the Mockery Palace in Fez. So the Mockery Palace, like other forms of palaces, belong to dignitaries. And they were actually, I would say the best that I would describe them is as agoras, since they were part of the dignitaries' home. They were used a lot for business encounters and political encounters, not anymore today. The fountains inside the madrasas, like here the Madrasa Bornania, that was used as Quranic schools. They still house students today for some of them. Others have turned into simply tourist destinations and as heritage. Another madrasa, one of my favorite one, called the Sahrij in Fez. Inside also funduks. I'm sorry, the image is cut here, but the funduk is the mini mall that I had mentioned to you. And finally, an interesting typology, which is the latrines and ablution hall. Those were the ancestors of the public bathrooms that also had, you know, like a central basin where people could actually enter with their feet in, so it's like a small pool for ablutions. What you see here are the bathrooms. So all the systems was being fed by the extensive water courses, since Fez lies in a deep valley. You know, like all of this fountains and basins and so forth were fed by this river system that went underground. But the wastewater also was sent back into the system, and you know, like the number of people in the city was low enough that the water system was sufficient to actually carry the wastewater. Another typology, of course, is the hammam that you can see here, which is a public bath, and the gardens that I had mentioned, like here the Jnanspil garden that has some magnificent set of fountains, and that was actually restored in 2012, 11. I'm going to be speaking about it briefly. And Fez actually has experienced actually growth in population, and also a diminishing of its water resources due to climate change. So I would say the majority of the public fountains that we've seen are not fed by the original water system. A lot of them are not connected anymore to the municipal water system. So they're actually not in use anymore. But one could see some of the remnants of the extensive water system of Fez. So this is one, a wheel from a mill that was in one of the gardens, and this is what remains of it today, unfortunately. And so one could start to wonder, you know, what's the state of this commons today? What are all of the pressures that have acted on it to transform it? So the Medina of Fez is still very homogeneous. We can see here, you know, like a very beautiful panorama. But when one looks very closely, one can find that the roots for this transformation, some parts of the root for this transformation of its urban fabric and of its common spaces actually originate from the colonial time and actually from the urban politics of the Généralité that you can see here. And the French have, in a way, taken a very, like an approach to their growth and the development of their new cities that's extremely, in a way, dominating and smart. It was, in a way, very subtle. It's actually this: the French decided to build their new town called Ville Nouvelle. Separated from the old city or the Medina for a very simple and smart reason, one of control. It was very easy for them to install a curfew and to lock the gates of the old city and then to be able to better control it. And so under the guise of preserving and respecting the local culture, this was actually a very smart way to control the Moroccan population. And the historian Paul Rabineau and as well as Jeannette Aboulougoud have actually written about the use of urbanism to control the Moroccan population by the French protectorate. And in the case of Fez, the city was located on top of the plateau so that it could actually overlook the old city and control it. So this is a photo of the old city of Fez in the 1930s. So the Moroccan protectorate started in 1912. So no major changes actually occur in the Medina of Fez. The French were actually very careful at preserving it and keeping it intact. And you can see here the relationship between the new town built by the French on the plateau and the Medina of Fez below. And in a way, this separation between the two cities and the industrialization of the new towns in Morocco have led to a new dynamic and shift in the population between rural and urban population. Since a lot of small peasants moved to the cities seeking jobs, since a lot of the land was actually grabbed by the French. And that led to the growth of shanty towns. And like after the independence in 1956, a lot of Moroccans that lived in the Medina moved to the new city. And that left a lot of the houses either empty or in a way free for occupation. And so people that usually were living in Shantytown around Fez moved into the old city that was seen in a way as backward and that had rent that was very low. So what that led to is to an overpopulation of the Medina and subdivisions of the original courtyard architecture, so and the family homes that usually housed one family, even an extended family. But here you had several families that shared the same home, and so that led to illegal constructions and a subdivision of homes into several units that Mona Sarageldin, that used to be my professor at Harvard, called the focalization, which mean the subdivisions of the heritage in several units that then was degraded. And another aspect of this, in a way, boom in the urban population in the Medina of Fez was that its water infrastructure was not sufficient anymore to carry its wastewater. So all of its sewage actually went into the Fez River, so that crossed the town. And that was not actually sufficient anymore to drain all of the waste. And there was also pollution brought about by plastic waste and so forth. So this was the state of the river about, I think this photo was taken by me in 2005, before I started working on the rehabilitation of the Fez River, which is a project I'm going to speak to you about very quickly. A lot of the fountains were not in use anymore because of the lack of water, and were just used either as trash or storage, or as even stores like here. Another key aspect of the transformation of the urban fabric and of the commons in the Medina of Fez was the introduction of the car. And the slowly some of the pedestrian streets were paved, made larger, and you had cars that started to affect the pedestrian network. And this is in a way very ironic in a town that prides itself from having the largest pedestrian network in the world, and that relied on people moving on foot, or if you had something heavy, you would actually hire a donkey. So this is an actual taxi stop. So if you had something very heavy, if you're old or tired, you can come here and then rent your own taxi that could go around the entire Medina with ease. So now I am going to be telling you very briefly about two projects of my office that deal with public space in the Medina of Fez, and that would show you also how this public space had transformed, and how my project attempt to reimagine its future. And one of the commonality of my approach is that I view historic preservation, because the whole Medina of Fez is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I view historic preservation as not as a manner to mummify heritage, but as a manner to answer the needs of the population while respecting the spirit of the place. So it's so I really view heritage as, in a way, a springboard to answer the needs of the population and new programs and so forth, but also to keep the city alive. What makes the city of Fez so unique is the fact that it is a heritage that's alive. And to be able to continue to keep it alive, then its common spaces and its public spaces that have transformed, like what we have seen, or disappeared altogether, have to be reimagined. So for the Fez River project, which I actually started as my thesis at Harvard University, supervised by Hashim Sarkis, started by actually looking at the larger context of the river. And you can see here Fez. And what you see is that the Fez River is part of the Cebu watershed. That's actually part of a very sensitive biological and ecological sites of interest. It's also the Cebu River Basin is the agricultural basket of Morocco. And one can see is that the water quality before it enters Fez and after it leaves Fez is actually ranked as extremely bad. And when we started to look more closely at the context of the river before it enters the Medina, which is located here, we noticed different points where the water gets polluted with its contact to the city, mainly by runoff or industrial waste. And we devised a set of different let's say strategies to deal with this pollution upstream before it enters inside the Medina of Fez. And the side that you can see in red is that what we noticed is that one of the major pollutants of this river were waste from the tanneries. And that was also one of the sites that we planned to transform. Because of the lack of time in this lecture, I'm just going to focus on one of the key sites inside the Medina. So our project dealt with a master plan that dealt with water quality, with landscape interventions, and then with 3 sites inside the Medina that also reimagined 3 public spaces. And I'm going to share with you one, which is the Receive Plaza that was actually constructed. So you can see here a photo of the Fez River from the 1920s, and one photo is taken by me. And this is one of the bridges that connected the left and right bank. And you've seen that it has become a terrible trash space. It was just, a wasteland. First of all, it was paved over. The river was paved because it was just stinking, because it became an open air sewage. So all of the wastewater, like I told you, went into this river. And on top of it all, after it was paved, it became, like a trash yard. And the two men you can see here, actually, I got them peeing and pooing. So it has become also an open air bathroom. And so when we did an analysis of the, let's say, bank of the river that you can see here, so this is all of the original river. All of this south portion was actually paved during colonial time to create an access to the core of the city, once again for control. And in this central side, a lot of houses were cleared to create, like a parking, which was terrible, parking in the center, and on a dead end, as you can imagine, cars and buses and taxis. So the Recife Plaza was our first site of intervention. And it was also a key site because it was at a moment, a disconnection moment between the paved river and the daylighted river as well. And the two other sites were next to the tanneries, and unfortunately I'm going to have time to talk about them today. So one of our main urban strategy was to connect the banks of the river that were disconnected, obviously to daylight portions of the river that had become the trash yard that I had shown you. The southern part, unfortunately, was covered for way too long and would have been impossible to uncover it. So only this northern part was daylighted. And then one of the main approach to our handling of this river was to really rethink it as a public space. Originally, it was not really viewed as a public space. My grandmother told me that they would not actually go by it. It was really a piece of infrastructure to take away the waste. However, it had fish. It was very clean, like according to her account. But today we wanted to reimagine it as a major public space, and obviously green public space, which was direly needed. As you can see here, in the Medina of Fez, it only counts 8 hectares of green spaces for 200,000 inhabitants. And the entire surface area of the Medina, in its entire surface area, only 2.7% is dedicated to green space, which is extremely, extremely low and below the standards that the UN recommends. So if we zoom in into the Recife Plaza, which, like I told you, had become a dead end, extremely chaotic and messy, always a cop had to be there to keep order. We actually moved all of the taxi station, the bus station, to this area, and we turned the entire plaza into a pedestrian plaza. And we created a stair connection and auditorium sitting that negotiated between this higher level of the plaza and then the two banks of the river. And this is the plaza today with its connection to the river, which we daylighted. And obviously to daylighted, there was a major project to connect the wastewater to a treatment plant that allowed then for the quality of the water to be improved. Another thing also we did was to, since we didn't have space on the banks to actually have plants, we proposed this floating gardens that actually improve the quality of the water by oxygenation. And we also, obviously involved the local population in our rethinking of the Recife Plaza as a public space. And those are some of the photos of the Fez River, north of the Recife Plaza, covered and being, like a westland. Then after we daylighted it, and finally we did transform as a public space with the floating gardens. And this is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the question and answer.
So greetings to everyone from New Delhi, and I really want to thank the Charles Correa Foundation for putting together this excellent panel, and I really want to congratulate all the speakers for their very stimulating, diverse, but very engaging presentations. So thank you very much. And I think it's been really great to have such an important issue of the commons today, when we are facing so many challenges in terms of access, accessibility, inclusion, and acceptance within city spaces. And I think all the presentations touched upon different elements of these three issues. And I think Liane started really beautifully by talking about the three principles of participation, interstitial and polycentric. And I think, you really wove the history of the playground so importantly. And if I had to say that you brought the lens of child rights really center stage. And I think that's what's so important when we speak about inclusion and access to commons, because we're really finding shrinking of the commons, and we are finding exclusion and enclosure of common spaces. And I think all of you touched upon that in different ways. And I think the transitions were also really beautiful, how Sushma, brought in the gender lens. And I think what was really important in your presentation was also looking at the continuum of the commons, right? So I think from rural to urban, but also in terms of access to spaces, but also to resources and services. And I think, looking at land, which is very central as a public asset, and looking at real estate coming in. And I think we are all seeing how these forces of patriarchy, masculinity, the market, the state are creating more levels of exclusion. And I think, Aziza, you brought in the history and the transition, of resilience and the evolution of a heritage city so beautifully. And I think what was really interesting was in the lens of development and culture and heritage, brought in together. So I think all presentations were really topical, even though they all had some historical elements to them. But in the current context, I find that the challenges we face are also of intersecting access, of discrimination. So, gender is one, but also class. And, Aziza, I would also, maybe in the questions ask you to think about, how has class and gentrification affected access to the whole city of Medina? And similarly, I think class was an element in Sushma's presentation that was quite clear, that we're talking about, lower income women, but what has been the role of the market and the state in preventing that feminization? Because we're seeing the forces of privatization very strongly enclosing spaces of the commons. And, to give an example, for instance, in Ahmedabad, we've had the Sabarmati riverfront development, which then makes a resource that everybody has access to, then accessible only to those of a certain class. And we find, discrimination in spaces. So it's, do you feel accepted in a public space? And then does that public space not just deny inclusion, but does it perpetuate discrimination? And I think these are issues that, the Black Lives Matter movement have brought into the forefront again for us, right? This race is, our space is equitably accessible to all who live within a city, or to, a majority, a religion, or a race, or a gender. And, in these intersecting access, where do people who are transgender persons fit in? How inclusive are they? Or persons with disabilities, how inclusive are these spaces for them? And I think the role of planning was very integral in Liane's and Aziza's presentations. But as planners, are these ethical questions at the forefront, or are they just, side effects that, okay, yes, these cities are being planned, or these spaces are being planned, and then the inclusion elements come later? But is design, the tool of design, really being used with the lens of inclusion? And I think these are some of the issues. And in the context today, of this pandemic, which of course excludes people from public spaces under the guise of health, and it is a serious health issue. But as we emerge towards, redefining the normal, how are we going to ensure that other issues of surveillance, of health policing, don't impact our access to these spaces? So these are some of the questions and thoughts that I had, but I really found it really fascinating that different dimensions came out through your presentations, that maybe these are things that could be teased out through the discussion. So I was wondering whether you would all like to say one or two things, or and maybe then I can open it to the questions. We have received some questions from the panelists. Liane, would you?
Well, I think there are two, word commons is being used in two different ways. One is public space as a synonym for public space. And the other one is a movement, a commons movement that is based on a very specific political philosophy, and that is that the state is by nature oppressive, and that what the real source of innovation and a humane environment is always something that's ground up, that's people powered, that's community centered. And that's not always true, I don't think. That's what I tried to show in my presentation, that the playgrounds phenomenon of Amsterdam was due in part to a very strong sense of belonging to the city and empathy with children post-war period, but also what was the beginning of my sentence? That it was also due to a very responsible government or state entity that responded to this call of its citizens, and that's I think very easy to lose sight of, that the whole urban miracle of post-war Amsterdam was due to the citizens, but was also due to a responsible state organization.
Right. I think the people power is something that's really beautiful, and the relationship between the state and the people as being one that has allowed this organic process to then develop to fruition. Sushma, in terms of the market state being obstacles or allies in terms of feminization of spaces, of the commons.
Well, actually, taking off from what Liane has said, I think there are two aspects in societies like ours here in India and South Asia. In a lot of such societies, citizens are themselves highly stratified and disenfranchised based on the class, caste, gender, religious identities that they occupy. And therefore, the collectivization of these plural groups is a very essential part of the creation of the commons, or the common as a movement, as Liane said, and that's very critical. And to make your governments more accountable, because that is really the only space you have of engaging. You cannot do that as individuals because you are highly disenfranchised individuals. So creating the community and commons as a lived experience becomes the only vehicle through which you can make governments accountable. But I also would like to add here that one tends to, when one looks at cities and urban spaces or even rural spaces, there is a tendency to kind of segregate the planning experience. Planning and architecture go together, but somehow looking at governance as occupying a separate space. And I think I agree with Liane that it's actually any process of planning and its resource allocations are inherently part of governance. And I think, for instance, applying the gender lens, it's very important to start learning, demanding for, understanding, disaggregating data from a perspective of, for instance, looking at gender budgets and undertaking gender audits of cities and spaces. So really trying to first understand the gender lens of governance itself, especially of local governance institutions like municipalities and local rural panchayats. So I think it is, of course, a constant dialectic, a constant the conflicts and the interplay between citizens who assert their identity as a collective and enabling governments to be able to understand and put out more disaggregated understanding and information of how they view citizens and what they allocate for them.
Right, thanks. And I think those elements of the commons as, evolving from spaces to resources to services, but also as productive sources of livelihoods, right? And I think, Aziza, in your presentation, you also brought that out as the commons as source of livelihood. And I was wondering whether you wanted to reflect anything on the gentrification process or whether class has played an element in the evolution of the Medina yet.
Yeah, of course. So in the case of the Medina of Fez, the transformation actually led to two dual processes. So the first one was that the population actually became much poorer. So there was rural population that started to move into the Medina of Fez, and so it's a lower social economic class. And so this is in a way one of the process, like that happened. And so the city grew very fast and the infrastructure didn't follow up. And then the other process was one where where the city started to be approached in the planning process in a very conservative manner. So it was in a way preserved as it used to be in the past. So this was almost a tendency to mummify it. So in a way, this approach did not allow for its transformation, the transformation of its commons to respond to the needs of the local population that in a way was required to leave their city, so the old town, to go to the colonial town, to have access to public spaces. So added to that, you have the start of gentrification by mainly foreigners that are buying heritage buildings and that before used to be opened to the public, or the state turning certain commons into museum attraction or tourist attraction that one has to pay to enter. So if you add all of these processes, you have a phenomenon of exclusion of the population of the Medina, which is the lower social economic class, from all of these traditional spaces of commons. And I think what my, in a way, argument that is not in a way seen as valid, but by many that are in position of powers, because I'm a woman, because it's in a way, it goes against the grain of the conservation approach to keep the Medina as it used to be 100 years ago. My argument is that it was always resilient. Its DNA has been able to sustain many, many changes. And the changes today that are required to keep it into a heritage that's alive is actually possible. On the Fez River, like I demonstrated, that used to be a piece of infrastructure only, could today act as this new commons that's needed by the citizens.
Thanks. And I think the issue of commons itself is so complex, and I think data and information are also the new commons that all come together under the umbrella of the right to the city, right? And who is the city for, and how are relationships between people and relationships between people and the city defined. So I think there's so many layers, as you rightly said. So I think in the next few minutes, we will take some questions from the audience. And Liane, there's a question for you from Amar. He asks, in India, most play areas and open spaces are highly controlled, private open spaces. They are not the most accessible. So what are lessons that Indian citizens can learn, and how can we demand more open public space?
Well, my comment isn't going to be so much based on a lesson, but on a fact. And that is that the 29 playgrounds that I talked about that existed in 1929, that were mapped by Cor van Estern, were private. They were, each one was enclosed, and each one was owned actually by a different religious group. And in order to get access to these playgrounds, you needed to have a key, and you could get a key only from this particular group. The innovative thing about, and it was possible because Cor van Estern represented public space. He owned his superiors owned the property of Amsterdam, which was in the public sector. He was able to just plunk public playgrounds in a very open way, without enclosures, and make them accessible to everybody. And by their very nature, they were because they were inserted inside a very dense urban tissue. They became centers of a very micro community, and each one of those micro communities, when taken together, formed a network of distributed small public spaces that in fact made up a gigantic public space. One gigantic public space made up of little incremental pieces that were all close together, that a pedestrian could take advantage of. In 5 minutes, a pedestrian could experience 3 or 4 of these public spaces. So there was a continuum, but
that's
a broken down continuum. It was a balance between a huge space and a tiny space.
Well, thanks.
And it happened ad hoc. It happened ad hoc in the beginning, and it was turned into policy. In a very short time by Van Estern.
Thanks.
How to implement this is to find another Cor van Estern, I think.
Well, we have complex dimensions of caste exclusion also in India, and so it's more apparent in the rural areas where the commons get determined by, people of certain caste, and then religious spaces also become sites of exclusion. So thanks for that interesting information. Sushma, there's a question from Kush. What is the importance of men in solving problems of women in commons? And how have you tackled this and included and educated men of the community?
As I mentioned on one of the slides, that it's education at 2 levels, and actually at 3 levels. To begin top down, educating those in governance. Of course, women elected representatives are women, but local governance institutions as a whole, which includes men, it includes male councillors. So that is very, very critical. And that is a process that has been going on. Simultaneously, working with and conscientizing the men of the traditional communities and of the community leaders, community leaderships in a city or in a space becomes very important, because they may be marginalized from the urban political space and economic space, but they assert their power entirely in their own community and the families. So working through these communities and with the men, educating them, conscientizing them consciously, and enabling them to actually start regulating, resolving, relooking, and revisiting their own norms and their own traditional laws becomes important. And the third and the most critical level is really the young boys in a city, the youth of a city. And so the organization which I mentioned, KMBS, has been actually undertaking a fairly large initiative with schools, colleges, with young boys in informal settlements, creating exclusive spaces. In a sense, the women's movement, and for 30 years, focus really was largely on first initially creating exclusive spaces of expression for women to be able to find a safe space for articulating their issues. Well, from there, it has moved to women being integrated and coming into community and more integrated spaces. But now it is actually reaching a point where you find spaces where young boys come together and you create exclusive spaces by which they are able to reckon with their own patriarchy and with their own social order, and also to be able to engage with girls and young girls in structured spaces of training and education, but also taking it into the more formal education spaces within the schools and colleges, which they go to, which has of course been deeply affected by COVID now. So yes, and I think this is something which is not specific to this particular presentation or discussion, but it's actually across society and country, that boys and men and the critical arm of our social order, who uphold and perpetuate and reproduce patriarchy. It's of course reproduced by men and women, but nobody really has focused exclusively on boys and young men to that extent. And I think the entire movement and the women's movement has been understanding and looking at women and looking at the issues of sexuality from a male perspective, looking at the masculine and discussing that, engaging boys and young men in those discussions with women, with each other, has become a very, very critical part of the movement. So yes, that these are strategies and measures that the collective take up in a big way.
Yeah, thanks, Sushma. I think the issue of education, socialization is so important, but also access to education, then, as a common good, is also something that one can have a separate debate on. So there's a question from Arun Devpant, and maybe Aziza, you could take this. How can we encourage municipal authorities to take steps that could help foster a sense of shared responsibility of the commons with their citizens? And then he also asks about, that most common spaces that include people of different social economic classes are religious spaces. So how do we create more real commons?
That's a very good question. And based on my own experience, I think that, like the role of the architect, if I can speak from this perspective, or the designer, need to expand its agency to include activism. And I think that a sense of citizenry and a sense like what we've seen just before regarding gender, I think raising awareness takes time. It can be very frustrating. Sometimes in a culture like Morocco, I wish I was a man. I think that my voice would have been heard in a much easier way, because sometimes your voice as a woman is questioned. But I think that to change mentalities and a way to approach public space in particular, can be a long-term effort, and one should not give up. I think there is, of course, many ways that one can do it, by speaking directly to the government officials, by making counter proposals. The Fez River project, for example, was a component of my thesis, my architecture thesis. That it was only a small component, but then in a way it spurred interest, it spurred attention. And I think once you use the tools of design to show potential, Like, for example, this was, I mean, if you look at a photo, you know, like an open air sewage, you know, like pool ground, etc. I think you can use this mini power of persuasion to convince the local authorities and get obviously the support from citizens themselves. Now you have the internet, so it's much more easier than when I started the Fez River project. I wish Facebook existed or if Instagram existed, it would have made my job, I think, much easier.
Okay, thank you. I think we're nearing the end of our time. So there's one question to all speakers, and I'll put it for all of you, and you can choose to take this and then make your closing remarks as panelists. What are the speakers' view of commons as a democratic space? So that's a question for all of you, and you can choose to take this or say something else in your closing remarks because we only have time.
I didn't understand the question.
What is your view of the commons as a democratic space? Or space here. So you can choose to answer that or just give your own closing remarks before we end, since we have just about 5 minutes to wrap up.
I think it's a hard question because it all depends on how we define the common. And we've seen in the different presentations, there are many dimensions to the common. It's very culturally grounded. Morocco, for example, is not a democracy, yet a lot of the public spaces are managed by community groups that in a way function as more or less democratic, let's say, sub-communities. By that, you know, I mean that sometimes there are some groups that are excluded. Those groups can include in some conservative circles, women or youth, or even sub-Saharan migrants that constitute parts of the city, of the polis in Morocco. So do they constitute the opportunity for a democratic space? I would say yes. Is it always implemented? In the case of Morocco, no.
Okay, thanks. Sushma, would you like to go next?
I'd like to add a rider to it that yes, commons can become a very critical part of a democratic space. But I look at it more in terms of a very critical decentralized space, and I think when we look at the commons, we look at the culture of the commons, the ethics and the principles of the governance of the commons vis-a-vis the governance of the state, so when you contemporize the debate and look at the dialectics of communities, people's rights. And access to resources vis-a-vis the state, then the commons really becomes a very strong decentralized space to in a sense manifest some basic issues of equity and pluralism.
Thank you. Thank you, yes. Liane?
I have trouble with the question because commons, in the sense of, I don't understand what commons means in this context. If you mean public space, if you mean it as a synonym of public space and is it democratic, yes, by definition. But there's always this question when you raise the issue of commons, because it has another reference and it has to do with the whole movement, a whole philosophy, which is which precludes the state, then it's more problematic. Then I don't know if it makes sense or not. That is, what's the best gap? If I can answer it this way, I would say that the best way of guaranteeing a democratic public space to have two things: for it to be bottom up and for it to be top down. That is, for it to be grounded in some kind of social fabric, and also in some kind of government policy.
Okay. Thank you.
Shivani, can I
Yes.
add a bit? Yeah.
Yeah.
Shivani, I think what one really needs to get into is the source of the word commons. While it is being brought into the urban space, the conceptualization of the commons itself is being vis-a-vis communities and their the use of the natural resources.
Yes.
And it is be largely vis-a-vis pastoralists, with fishers, with forest dwellers. And so it's really the relationship between people and natural resources. And of course, the debate between the overuse of natural resources vis-a-vis the fact that, well, when resources used as in the commons, it's optimized much better and more equitable. Now that concept has really moved from there into a very, very different space of the urban, where you're not dealing with really of natural resources per se, but you're looking at the relationship with a land which is limited, and the cities in a sense, the city itself becomes a space of commons. So it is really people's interaction and relationship with each other and vis-a-vis the state that we are now defining as the commons. So it gets a little confusing. And I think one needs to really get deeper into this debate of extrapolating a concept from a very different context into the urban. And I think that is what Liane is really referring to, and I completely agree with her.
Yeah, I think I think all your points have been really interesting and useful to have these perspectives. It's also looking at access to spaces that help build inclusive cities, and then commons would include, of course, streets, the parks, the playgrounds, the public transportation, and access.
Then it loses, if it means everything, it means nothing.
Yeah.
What's the use of
access? And I think
commons comes with a package. The concept commons comes with a package, with an intellectual package. And it's very different from the package that's associated with a word like public space. And so, and the package that goes with commons has this, presupposes a certain way of looking at the state as something oppressive. And it can be oppressive, but not necessarily, as we've seen in the case of Amsterdam. Elinor Ostrom, the person who most represents this concept and who won a Nobel Economics Prize for it, does have this attitude towards the state, an a priori mistrust of the state. And I don't know if that's always justified.
Yeah, I guess one's lived experiences shape a lot of how one thinks and perceives. And I think that the panelists' different views have also brought in, I think, so many complexities, which of course we didn't have enough of time to explore. But I think looking at also using the commons to promote democracy and to promote inclusion and to promote equity is something I think that's a message that I feel really came out in all the presentations about engendering and creating that kind of breaking down certain norms of discrimination and exclusion. And I think these are challenges for all of us in our work, in our different geographies and spaces and political spaces that we occupy. But I think it's been really an honor for me to but to be the discussant for this session and to learn from all of you. It's been so inspiring to have an all-women panel. So I think and the work that all of you are doing is really fascinating and so grounded in reality. And I think that's what's really important, that each one is trying to contribute to building a better world. So thank you so much. And I think
you, and I wanted to thank the technical team too.
Yes, they've been really amazing.
Shivani, I would really like to thank the entire technical team, Tahir especially. When I went live, it was entirely thanks to him that I was helped. So thank you, and thank you for moderating this so beautifully, and Nandita. Thank you.
Yes, Nandita, would you close?
Yeah, no, thank you, for three really excellent presentations. Liane, Sushma, Aziza, thank you very, very much. And thank you, Shivani, too, for leading this discussion. I think, there were sort of many things, yes, we learned, but sort of really expanding our understanding of the commons to, talking about whether the perspective of children, of women, of like the Medina, the fact that water, which is there as a resource, perhaps in the water table, but that we can sort of extract that to bring it as the commonality with, for everyone. And I think that, as you were describing, is perhaps the way that really the commons has to be seen. And politically, that is really important to have spaces that really are inclusive. And I think also that they're secular and inclusive is important, and that they can cut through all classes of society. And so I think this discussion is perhaps our most important session in many ways, because we really are looking for these pieces and what it means at the neighborhood level as well. And so I just want to thank all of you for bringing this together so beautifully. And I'm also very, very proud that it's an all-woman panel. I'm really, that says a lot, and I'm very, very happy with that. And so thank you all, and also thank you again, yes, to the whole team. It's been a really very sort of strong team to put all this together. So thanks, everyone. Thank you. And we meet again next Saturday, the 19th at 6 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.